They've taken 47 million Sudanese hostage in the process and taken countless lives. They and their armies have killed just under 1,000 Sudanese in the last 4 weeks. There are literally dead bodies strewn across Khartoum. Some people who have been evacuated from Khartoum have described it as Armageddon in terms of like the hellish situation that they had to go through to get out of Sudan.
Samah, could you do me a favor and tell us, to your knowledge, what is the situation inside Sudan right now in terms of the fighting between the army and the RSF?
JJ, first of all, thank you for giving Sudan a platform. And Sudan and Africa in general. The situation in Sudan is really critical. The violence is on an uptick. You have two military leaders, General Burhan, who leads the Sudanese Armed Forces, or the regular army, which is the institutional army of Sudan. The second general is General Hemeti, and he leads a paramilitary mercenary militia in Sudan. And both of their armies are about equal in size. And basically what they're doing right now is they're fighting for control of Sudan, for control of the government. They both have ambitions in terms of wanting to lead Sudan, and they've taken 47 million Sudanese hostage in the process and taken countless lives. To date, they've killed, they and their armies have killed just under 1,000 Sudanese in the last 4 weeks. Those are formal official numbers, but there are literally dead bodies strewn across Khartoum. Some people who have been evacuated from Khartoum have described it as Armageddon in terms of like the hellish situation that they had to go through to get out of Sudan. The number of injured, so in terms of the people who have been killed, we're estimating at just around 1,000, and that's in Khartoum and in Darfur, where a lot of violent fighting is also taking place. The real numbers could be 3,000 at least, in terms of the actual counts. Injuries, we're talking 2,000 and more, possibly in the range of 5,000 to 10,000 Sudanese injured.
Let me ask you this question. I've been hearing from several people that the hospitals have been put in a really bad situation because what's been happening is some of the surgeons and the medical professionals have been either killed or injured or kidnapped in some cases by, I think it's the RSF that have done this. Is that accurate?
Oh, that's 100%. That's absolutely accurate. To date, right now, 70% of hospitals across Sudan are completely out of service. And for the remaining 30% of hospitals that are in service, you have a shortage of medical professionals who are able to work in those hospitals safely. You also have a situation where the RSF, the paramilitary troops, are actually using hospitals as human shields. So they'll come into a hospital, take over the hospital, and use it as sort of a bunker. So you have a situation where the violence is actually now inside the hospitals, and you've had people seeking treatment who have been killed as a result of some of the shellings and bombings of hospitals. In the last few days, you've had 3 hospitals bombed and completely destroyed by the Sudanese Armed Forces, who are basically trying to take out those installations where RSF are hiding. So it's a complete, we're on the verge of one of the worst humanitarian disasters in recent history, and it could be worse than the Yemen humanitarian crisis.
So there's been talk about peace negotiations for the last week or so.
Yeah.
Is that happening? Is that even realistic at this point, considering what you just told us?
So over the last 4 weeks, there have been 7 or 8 ceasefires, attempted ceasefires, that have been sort of negotiated by different parties. The ceasefires have all been violated. So whether it is the Sudanese Armed Forces or the RSF paramilitary, they've violated the ceasefire. They haven't honored them. The current situation is you have the United States and Saudi Arabia have taken leadership in terms of hosting negotiations in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And just last week, they came out with the Jeddah Declaration of Commitment to Protect the Civilians of Sudan. And so that has been an attempt to get the military generals to at least recognize the fact that Sudanese citizens have basic fundamental human rights, and that it's their duty to protect civilians and not kill them. So the negotiations are moving rather slowly. The first phase is that declaration. The second phase that they're working on right now is basically a silencing of the guns, an immediate ceasefire to achieve, humanitarian safe corridors, because currently international NGOs and local NGOs have stopped working. NGO workers have been evacuated from Sudan. I believe the only NGO currently in Sudan is MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, and they are very brave, extremely dedicated. The negotiations are tough. They're difficult because both generals think they can win. It's a winner-take-all situation. And they're basically in a stalemate right now where they've each got forces on the ground. The Sudanese armed forces have an air force, and so they're basically using their air fire to shell and to bomb from above. The RSF, which is a paramilitary, has surface-to-air missiles, so they can sort of defend themselves against attack and try to bring down a few planes, but their strategy is more urban warfare. So you've got the war taking place in very densely populated areas where the RSF and the ASF are shooting at each other. So it's an extremely dangerous situation, and that tells you why you have so many dead bodies on the streets. We're pushing very hard for the current negotiations to be supported by all international actors, because we need as wide a coalition, as broad an international coalition as possible, to bring a huge amount of pressure on these generals, because they're relentless about their ambitions to control Sudan. And unfortunately, the negotiations, the ceasefire negotiations, have been going extremely slowly.
Yeah. What about the Wagner group, the Russian group there? There's been a lot of talk about them actually influencing this situation. Is there any truth to that? And what is your understanding of their impact on this conflict?
Absolutely, JJ. The Wagner group have a very poisonous and very toxic role in the Sudan war. And it's a situation where Russia, Putin, actually is feeding both sides of the conflict. It sounds pretty crazy, but the reason that's happening is that the Sudanese army and the RSF paramilitary were actually allies before the war broke out, because they were in a power sharing agreement where they basically conducted a military coup where they ousted the democratic prime minister who has been leading Sudan since the Sudanese revolution in 2019. I know that's a little bit confusing. So the situation is that General al-Burhan, commander of the Sudanese army, has an agreement with Putin to allow Russia to build a naval base in the Red Sea. And the US has been rightfully upset about this and very frustrated with this. At the same time, the Wagner group, paramilitary mercenary group, works very closely with the other side, General Hemeti, who is also a mercenary. So what happens here is that you have Hemeti has given the Wagner group rights to some of the gold mines in Darfur, in the west of Sudan. And in exchange, Hemeti gets weapons, he gets arms, and he gets military training. And this has been the case for the past 4 years. And something that I think some of our listeners might not be aware of is that there's been an expose done where the gold that is smuggled out of Sudan to Russia a big chunk of that is being used to finance Russia's war on Ukraine. And, there have been some outlets and some investigative journalists who've done exposés on that. And so the Ukraine war and Sudan war are actually intertwined in a very strange, twist of fate. And the link there is the Russian Wagner group. So they have a very, very dangerous role in the Sudan war. And Russia, basically Russia's involvement in and interests in Sudan are causing this conflict to be prolonged and protracted.
Couple more things for you. What would it take, from your perspective, in your opinion, to stop the fighting? Clearly, it's going to either be some kind of external force or some kind of internal mistake or problem with one of the armies. That's just my uneducated view about it. What are your thoughts about it?
JJ, that's a tough question, and that's something that we as, activists and Sudanese who are trying to help influence policy are really having a hard time with. And the reason that's so difficult is that the military in Sudan and the paramilitary, they're extremely powerful. They have a huge amount of financial resources. Recently, President Biden passed an executive order that would apply targeted sanctions. And I want to be very clear about the fact that they're targeted sanctions and they're meant to cut the supply of finances and apply, visa and travel restrictions to the two generals and anyone else who is complicit in the Sudan war. It's important to stress that we have lobbied very hard for there to be targeted sanctions and not comprehensive sanctions, because comprehensive sanctions tend to hurt the Sudanese people and the entire population. So the US has really taken a leadership role there. What's missing is for the US to actually name names in those sanctions. So what they've said is that they are currently leading alongside the Saudis the negotiation efforts in Jeddah. And if the generals aren't willing to come to some sort of agreement soon, that they're going to have to take out that stick and start to wield those consequences of sanctions. The only other real thing that could help is to cut off the supply of weapons. And that's really, really tough, because even though you have a UN arms embargo against Sudan, and even though the US also has policy that says that they will not supply the US with arms, arms are coming into Sudan through Libya, through General Haftar of Libya. They're coming in through the Russians. They're coming in through, we think, some of the other Arab and African states. And the problem there is that those countries and those routes are largely outside of the formal arms trading supply chains that the arms embargoes actually restrict. So most of these are smuggled arms, coming in through the border of Chad, for example. So it's really, really hard to control those. So the only other thing you can do is try to cut the financial flow that is helping those generals buy these arms. And basically the US's leadership in terms of sanctioning the generals helps with that. But we also want to see leadership from countries like Turkey, like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Russia in terms of cutting the flow of finances that's supplying these generals. And you can understand in terms of the geopolitics and the interests, how challenging that is.
Yeah. Very last thing before we run out of time here. I've got to run. I know you do too, but I want to ask this question though, Samah. The war in Ukraine has been going on for a while, and sometimes it's a struggle to keep people focused on the importance of that war. And I am concerned that the same might take place with this conflict. The further we get away from the daily reports of tragedies, as horrible as it is, the less attention people pay to this festering problem, as we didn't pay a lot of attention to it in the run up to it when we should have been. We should stay focused on this now. So, what are the reasons why we need to stay focused? What are the reasons why people in the United States and in other places need to focus on this? Because if Sudan loses, the rest of us lose too. Why is it? Explain why we need to stay focused on it.
We need to stay focused because Sudan has been, the Sudanese people and Sudanese youth um, created a revolution in 2019. And I think a lot of people saw the media coverage of that. And what a grand and beautiful revolution it was in our, you know, in our uh basically our we're looking for Sudan to become a democratic country. And so in our quest for democracy, we are now at a point, we're at a really difficult tipping point where either Sudanese prevail and are able to bring an end to this war with the help of the international community, or we get stuck in a very long and protracted war, and our dreams and aspirations of democracy are postponed to a very distant future goal. So the thing is that we share the same values that Americans share, that everyone else in the world shares, which is the desire to live, a life of dignity, a life where we have personal freedoms, we have the freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and the basically to live in a society where you don't fear reprisal, you don't fear that your human rights are going to be violated, that you're going to be bombed or shelled, or your home is going to be completely destroyed when you wake up in the morning. So what we want is basically what every other human citizen in this world wants, which is to live a life of dignity in a country that is democratic.
Samah, thank you very much for so eloquently explaining to us this serious issue and this problem, laying it out for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, JJ, for this platform and for giving the Sudan crisis a platform. I appreciate that, and so do my fellow Sudanese brothers and sisters.